If you're going to buy a circuit breaker and you don't know what you're buying, how do you know which one of these is the correct circuit breaker? So there are a number of things to consider before you purchase or replace a circuit breaker. You're not just going to go to the hardware store and pick one off the shelf. You know, about half the time when people ask me about replacing a circuit breaker, the circuit breaker is not the problem, it's something else, but they think it's the circuit breaker. So if you have a circuit breaker that keeps tripping and you think the circuit breaker is the problem, it is not. Something else is the problem. That's what the circuit breaker is supposed to do. Over the years, a lot of people have asked about buying circuit breakers. Many times they just go to the store and think they're just going to pick a circuit breaker off the shelf. But there's a lot more to buying circuit breakers than just picking one like produce. So the thing that you have to remember about circuit breakers is that when you're buying a circuit breaker, you're buying it for a specific type of electrical panel, kind of like parts for your car. And the circuit breaker has to fit in that panel. It has to be made for that panel, has to be UL listed for that panel. So but when you buy a circuit breaker, there are 3 things that you need to know before you just go buy one. Right? So that's the dead breaker. Test the next one.
This one?
Yeah, there you go. The 3 things that you need to replace a circuit breaker are the brand, the model with some, and the size of the circuit breaker. There's 3 things that you're looking for when you're buying a circuit breaker. So first of all, you're looking for brand or manufacturer of the type of breaker. As far as the brand of the circuit breaker, on newer panels or if your old panel is still in good repair, if you look in the door of the panel, when you open up the door of the panel, you're going to see a sticker there. That sticker is going to tell you the brand of that panel. If it's worn off, you can look at the circuit breaker itself. So somewhere on the front or the side of the circuit breaker, if you take it out, you'll see the brand of the circuit breaker there. Or if you can't tell at all, just take the circuit breaker out and hopefully you can match it up. It's not really the best option unless you really know what you're looking for. Hopefully wherever you go, whichever retailer or wholesaler you go to match the circuit breaker, they can help you identify the specific breaker that you have in your panel. You can get the brand of the breaker on the breaker itself, or I took the cover off here. There's a label on the covers that tells you the brand. So you do have to know the brand of the circuit breaker. You also have to know the model of the type of circuit breaker. Some manufacturers like GE and Square D, they make a couple different models of residential circuit breakers, so make sure you get the model type. The other thing you need to know is the size of the circuit breaker. So on the handle of the circuit breaker, it'll tell you the amperage. And the third thing that you have to know is the size of the circuit breaker, the amps of that circuit breaker. So on the handle of the circuit breaker or somewhere on the face of the circuit breaker, it'll tell you the amperage. You know, if it's at the house, you're normally going to see a 15 or a 20 amp. You might see a 30 or a 40 or a 50 or a 60 amp, but you won't see very many of those in there if you do. So those are the 3 main things that you need before you purchase your circuit breaker. And then the size of the circuit breaker, which is normally on the handle. So there's a 20, there's a 50, this is a 30 here. So there's a couple of things that you can do to determine the size of the circuit breaker. Is, like I mentioned, you can actually look at the handle or the face of the circuit breaker. The other thing you can do is, or one of the other things you can do is look at the size of the wire. If you don't have experience with wire sizes, this might not be easy for you, but the specific wire gauge will allow a specific amperage of wire. And just as one example, 14 gauge wire handles 15 amps, so you'll have a 15 amp breaker. So normally that's something that an electrician would look at, but it is possible for you, if you can determine the size of wire, that'll help you determine the size of your breaker. The other thing you can do is identify the load or the requirements of the circuit. So for example, if it's a dedicated circuit and say you have like a dedicated air conditioner, that piece of equipment, that air conditioner is going to have a specific requirement or circuit breaker protection that is going to be required, and then you can go by that. Normally you would look at the equipment if you were installing a new dedicated circuit, in other words buying a new breaker, not necessarily replacing a breaker. So some equipment is different and it's going to require different breaker sizes. I don't know, you might be installing a jacuzzi or a pool or a sauna or a so whatever the equipment requirements would be the size of the breaker that you needed. Normally when a circuit breaker fails, it fails open or closed and you can't reset it. So it's going to work or it's not going to work. So one thing to keep in mind is before you go and replace your circuit breaker, if you think the breaker is the problem, I would always recommend that you determine that the circuit breaker is the problem before you go purchase a breaker and replace it. It may not fix the problem. In fact, a lot of times people think that the circuit breaker is a problem because it's tripping when it's not the problem. It's telling you that there is a problem, but it's not the problem. And so there's a couple things you could do before you actually purchase that circuit breaker. First of all, is what I'd recommend you do is make sure that the breaker is just not tripping because of overload. So if you plugged in a bunch of heaters, it's going to trip the circuit breaker because those heaters are using a lot more electricity or amperage than the circuit breaker will allow, and the breaker is going to trip, which is what it's supposed to do. The other thing you can do is make sure that there's not a short in the circuit. So if you're in the house and the circuit breaker trips, and at the same time you heard a pop and you might smell like an electrical or electronic burning smell, or maybe you saw the outlet or the device arc or pop, and then like a smoke or carbon residue coming out of it, that's a good indicator of a short, which would have tripped the circuit breaker as well. In this case, the problem is not with the circuit breaker, it's the equipment or the plug or wherever the short is, which you would have to fix and not replace the circuit breaker. So one last thing that you can do to test your circuit breaker is to disconnect the wire from the circuit breaker and then reset it. What this will do is this will isolate the breaker from the circuit. If you disconnect the wire and then you reset the breaker and the breaker does not trip, then you know that the problem is in the circuit or the equipment in the circuit somewhere, and the circuit breaker is doing its job and the circuit breaker is fine. If you disconnect the wire and the breaker will not reset or it stays tripped, then you know that the breaker is bad and you got to replace the breaker. So that's a pretty quick and easy test that you can do